have the honor and function of introducing Noam Chomsky this evening. And the first of the responsibilities in introducing anyone is to make announcements. I have an announcement. Would you please announce that there will be a meeting of those working on the teach-in against the war and the Bloomington Peace Action Coalition on Wednesday, October 14th, 7:30 p.m. in Ballantyne Hall, room 310. All interested persons are urged to attend. End the War Now, Jot Kendall and Rick Garrissey. Okay, the meeting is for announcing the plans for a march from the football stadium to Dunn Meadow on October 31st, anti-Vietnam Indochina War demonstration, sponsored by Bloomington Peace Action Coalition. Okay, I have two more functions in this introduction. The first would seem to me to be to introduce to the audience the speaker. In regard to that function, the works of Noam Chomsky are so fantastically extensive, covering the fields of linguistics, mathematics, psychology, sociology, pedagogy, philosophy, you name it. And that is inconceivable that anyone here needs to be introduced to him. You already should know him, certainly through his works. The second function would be as a song of praise for the speaker, and Noam Chomsky doesn't need it. I consider myself totally extraneous and therefore hasten to introduce you.
I think I have to begin by apologizing for the state of my voice and asking you to keep your fingers crossed that it lasts through the talk. It'll be touch and go, I'm afraid, but I hope you'll be able to hear me. I'm just getting over kind of flu or something. It was suggested to me that I talk about some aspect of the relationship between intellectuals and their society. And I thought at first of speaking about this in a rather general and abstract, perhaps, if you like, almost philosophic way, but decided against it, decided that I would rather concentrate on some more concrete and immediate aspects of this type of question. The reason, I think, is fairly obvious. This particular question, the relation of intellectuals to their society, under a slight transformation, we might say, has become a very central and significant one in current American political debate. It's obvious that as no time in the past, the university is now the home of the American intellectual community. There are very few separate, independent centers of intellectual life outside of the university, as there were in the past. To a greater and greater extent, this ceases to be true. Therefore, the problem of the relation of the intellectuals to their society becomes, to a large extent, the problem of the relation of the universities to their society. And this is a troubled and topical issue, one which I think is of very great significance in itself, and the resolution of this issue, I think, will have enormous impact on American society, and because of the power and the threat and the promise of America for the world at large. The title of this talk, I don't know if it ever got announced or not, is Choice of Action. The title was taken, stolen perhaps is a better word, from a recent book about a quite remarkable group of French intellectuals who emerged from the Second World War resistance with the conviction, in the words of Sartre, that we exist only if we act. a group that was determined not to revert to the pre-war apathy and resignation, to what the author of the book refers to as the permissiveness towards history and those who were leading it towards catastrophe. And the title of the book, in turn, is drawn from an early manifesto of this group, a manifesto which announces a struggle, I'm now quoting, a struggle against that pathetic and prophetic spirit which is becoming more widespread every day and which demands of our contemporaries blind decisions and painful commitments. It's not true that the world is divided into two empires of good and evil. It is not true that we cannot think without weakening, nor be strong without talking nonsense. It is not true that good intentions justify everything, nor that we have the right to the opposite of what we want. The comedy of history, the switching of roles, and the frivolity of the actors do not prevent us from discerning a clear enough course of action, provided only that we take pains to know what is going on rather than to nourish phantasms, and provided that we distinguish anguish from anxiety and commitment from fanaticism. These remarks, which were enunciated 25 years ago, have a strikingly contemporary ring to them, transplanted across the Atlantic. They pose questions and I think give some good advice that might be taken to heart by American intellectuals today. There is very definitely a pathetic and prophetic spirit which is becoming more widespread every day and is driving at least some of our contemporaries to blind decisions and painful commitments. Then, as now, I'm afraid it's far too optimistic to speak of a clear enough course of action. In fact, even the ambiguity of the title, Choice of Action, even that ambiguity remains a prior problem. Is it in fact at all proper for an American intellectual today to choose action rather than merely thought or analysis or persuasion, all of which are certainly in short enough supply? And if he should decide to choose action, then what course of action is legitimate and well designed to respond to the warnings of that pathetic and prophetic spirit that demands painful commitments and decisions which, if not strictly speaking blind, are nevertheless surely enshrouded in mist as well as very often in gloom. The pathetic and prophetic spirit that I have in mind is well expressed, for example, by Hans Morgenthau, who can hardly be written off as a radical or as inexperienced or thoughtless. He's recently formulated an analysis of the present situation of American society, which is virtually a call for revolution, although he didn't present it or perhaps even intend it precisely in that manner. He writes that it should by now have become obvious that the great issues of our day, the militarization of American life, the Vietnam War, race conflicts, poverty, the decay of the cities, the destruction of the natural environment, are not susceptible to rational solutions within the existing system of power relations. These problems, he writes, are a result not of accidental misfortunes, but of social and economic policies in whose continuation powerful social groups have a vested interest. The overriding single issue is the distribution of power in American society, which has survived essentially undisturbed all movements for reform, movements which appear in retrospect as essentially futile attempts at accomplishing through rational and moderate reform what can be accomplished only by a radical shift of power and priorities, either through the disintegration of the existing power structure or through revolution. What is interesting about such remarks is particularly their source. Let me remind you, this is not Tom Hayden, but Hans Morgenthau, who I'm quoting. American society, he writes further, has definitely chosen to reject its rhetorical commitment to equality and freedom and to use all the means at its disposal to preserve the existing system of injustice at home and abroad as its ultimate purpose. It is, he says, the conformist subservience to those in power that guarantees this result. The universities, which is to say the intellectual community, are a case in point. And Morgenthau's strictures regarding the universities can be read as a critique, as an indictment of the American intellectual community as a whole, given the fact that it is so centrally located within the universities and, in fact, to be identified almost with the universities. He says that the universities claim to be dedicated to the disinterested search for truth about man, society, and the universe, but they have transformed themselves through the very dynamics of their undertakings into gigantic and indispensable service stations for the powers that be, both private and public. They serve society but do not sit in judgment on it. I think it would be more accurate to say that they serve not society, but the private and public power that dominate society and that are tightly interlocked. He continues saying, much of what the university presents as truth is either not truth at all or truth only by accident, arrived at because it furnishes the powers that be with ideological rationalizations and justifications for the status quo. Indictments of American intellectuals in such terms are no longer sound extreme and are no longer confined to the fringes of the New Left. In fact, one doesn't have to look to the huge laboratories, defense laboratories on campus, laboratories, say, that produce counterinsurgency technology or advanced guidance systems for new generations of missiles. One doesn't have to look to such obvious examples as an index of the politicization of American universities during the Cold War years. It's enough, in fact, it's far more revealing, to consider simply such matters as the choice of research topics. Let me illustrate with two rather dramatic examples. A couple of months ago, Jacques de Cournois of Le Monde wrote an analysis of American research on Thailand, which was entitled Thailand Laboratory for Counter-Revolution. I'll give you just a few words of background. Thailand, as you know, of course, has been the Central American base for its Southeast Asian operations for many years, ever since the brief attempt at parliamentary democracy in 1946 was cut short shortly after by a military coup with immediate American support. The liberal parliamentary reformer who had won that election, the only election in Thai history, he soon found his way to China, whereas the dictator, the military dictator who took over, got quick and extensive support from the United States. Some historians regard this as ironic because the liberal reformer who ended up in China had actually worked with the American OSS as head of the Free Thai guerrilla movement during the war, while the fascist dictator who took over with American support was the person who ruled Thailand under the Japanese dictatorship and had declared war against the United States. But I think people who regard that as ironic are too formalistic, you might say. They are failing to recognize I see no further comments are necessary. Since that time, substantial American aid has maintained the dictatorship, which is brutal and venal. In 1961-62, when the Pathet Lao guerrillas were about to take over Laos, after the failure of what were really extremely clumsy American efforts to subvert the parliamentary solution, which was working quite successfully in Laos, but had the unfortunate quality that it gave significant power to the people who won the elections, namely the communists. After the failure of these efforts at subversion, when the Pathet Lao were about to take over the country, the United States did send substantial military forces to Thailand as a threat to try to prevent this. In May 1964, Thailand was used as the base for the bombing of Laos, which began in that month secretly. And of course, it was used as a major base, again secretly, for the bombing of North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which began in February 65, 9 months later. Since 1968, Thailand has been the major base for the very intensive, no longer secret, but still largely unknown bombardment of the civil society of Laos and South Vietnam, and of course now Cambodia. Thailand has received $1.5 billion in what is euphemistically called aid in the past 7 years. It has about 40,000 American troops. According to the recent congressional hearings, they're combating a threat of aggression from China, which at the moment consists of 100 Thai guerrillas who were trained in China, according to the administration testimony. That much is background. What the Cornouah is discussing in the articles that I'm referring to is the academic contribution to this effort. The details are a little bit hard to come by since this kind of academic research is not entirely public. A good deal of it's classified, and a great deal is inaccessible, though unclassified, for example, in the ARPA library in Bangkok. What is known reveals that the United States has, I'm quoting now the Cornouah, has undertaken extensive studies aimed at acquiring a thorough knowledge of the workings of Thai society with the unstressed aim of more easily controlling them. Continuing to quote, examination of the scanty published information on these activities, together with certain confidential or classified documents unearthed by American students last spring in a useful choice of action. This examination throws some light on this new type colonial policy and its use of scholarly research for its own ends. Research covered a broad range of subjects, among them village sociological structure, the functioning of miniature listening devices in a tropical forest, the motivations of Thai policemen, leech eradication, and the maneuverability of light armor and flooded rice paddies. Testing of heat changes in the forests with the object of tracking down guerrillas, detailed studies of various rubber plantations, penetration possibilities, ground movements, visibility from the air through the different types of foliage, influence of forests of various kinds on radio transmission, defoliation possibilities, detection of tunnels and concealed metal objects, uses of hovercraft, clear low dikes, village studies, techniques for population and border control, gadgets to smell out the enemy, as well as the functioning of telecommunication systems under tropical conditions, study of communication problems and under various conditions of insurgency, aerial reconnaissance and infrared spotting techniques, computer analysis of theoretical guerrilla attacks and counterinsurgency tactics, all pure research, as you see. These programs are under either ARPA, which is the research branch of the Pentagon, or the AID program. The AID program defines its mission officially as, I quote from the AID definition, supporting the Royal Thai government in its efforts to contain, control, and eliminate the communist insurgency in rural areas. AID, in accordance with this program, sets up mobile police units with helicopters, and it sponsors studies of village sociological structures to analyze the human environment in which the guerrillas operate, in their terminology. It's concerned with such questions as these. I pick out a few. Is the prevailing pattern of village organization in the Northeast adequate to cope with insurgency? What can be done to strengthen this pattern? Is there anything in the village pattern of family organization that's relevant to the promotion of village security? And so on. These AID programs are implemented by academic scholars and university programs through the medium of CDAG, Southeast Asia Development Advisory Group, and the Academic Advisory Committee for Thailand. These represent themselves as purely apolitical research sponsorship organizations, and they take great umbrage if anyone accuses them of having a political purpose. In fact, if you look at what they do, one contract at the University of California stipulates that the university will compile all available information concerning research on Thailand and will organize, coordinate, and conduct meetings, seminars, or conferences under the sponsorship of this Academic Advisory Council with the overall objective to support and strengthen the operations of the U.S. aid program in Thailand. Recall that that goal is as the official objective of supporting the Royal Thai government in its efforts to contain, control, and eliminate the communist insurgency in rural areas. This being, of course, an essential component of American policy in Southeast Asia. So with a brief syllogism, you can deduce how apolitical these research efforts are. That's one example of value-free, pure research. In contrast, let me quote a paragraph from a forthcoming article by David Horowitz, who's been interested for a number of years in studying the role of American corporations in domestic and foreign policy. He writes the following. Consider the following organization. It has a budget exceeding $15 billion, or 4 times the gross national product of Cuba. More powerful than many sovereign states, it has 150,000 agents, organizers, and hired hands, operating 250 sub-organizations in more than 50 countries. It's part of an international syndicate which controls the economic lifeblood of half a dozen strategic countries in the underdeveloped world. In itself, it is a major political force in the key electoral states of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas, and it has close links with other syndicate members, which are major political forces in California, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, and elsewhere. Members also, which are its agents and their associates occupied the cabinet post of Secretary of State in the administrations of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and at the same time had influence in the CIA and other foreign policy-making organizations of government at the highest levels. It has its own intelligence and paramilitary networks and a fleet of ships larger than the Greek Navy. It's not a secret organization, but it is run by a self-perpetuating oligarchy whose decisions and operations are secret, and these affect directly and significantly the level of activity in the whole U.S. economy. The organization, as you probably guessed, is the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. There can be no question as to the front-rank significance of this corporation in the American economy or in American politics. Yet there does not exist a single independent academic study of the operations of the Standard Oil Company, its relation to other interest groups in the American economy or polity, or its impact on American social, political, or economic life generally. Nor is this lacuna in the academic perception of corporate power unique. I mention these 2 examples for an obvious reason. A comparison of academic research on Thailand and on the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, comparison of the academic research on both is quite illuminating. The conclusions to be drawn from this comparison are sufficiently obvious so that I will waste no time in drawing them or discussing them. But the comparison does illustrate, in a very significant way, I think, many other examples could be used to illustrate it as well, the intense and overwhelming politicization of the universities in the past generation, as they have undergone what Morgenthau quite correctly and accurately describes as a process of conformist subservience to those in power. Now, a consideration of this process of conformist subservience, which is quite undeniable and is quite considerable in its proportions, raises some very pertinent questions for intellectuals who are concerned with the choice of action, even in a narrow sense of choice of action in the professional domain, in areas of professional concern. Peter Berger, several years ago, remarked that as the physicists are busy engineering the world's annihilation, the social scientists can be entrusted with the smaller mission of engineering the world's consent. The remark is quite on target. And characteristically, it has been students who've been in the forefront of the recent challenge to the conformist subservience, the intense politicization of the universities, and who have been asking quite properly and quite belatedly, in fact, whether they should willingly fit themselves into their assigned place in engineering the world's consent to the international order designed by the ruling circles of the great powers. Is it, for example, at all proper to carry out research on Thailand, if it will be used, as undeniably it will, to prop up a particular ruling elite, which, quite apart from its corruption and its inequity, quite apart from the fact that it's now engaged in a massive effort to pacify the Mayo tribesmen by driving them from their mountain homes with bombs and napalm, quite apart from all such things, also happens to provide the base for the long-term American effort to subjugate Indochina and dominate Southeast Asia, an effort which, I might add parenthetically, shows no signs, in my opinion, of diminishing. De Cournois, in the article that I referred to earlier, writes, "The object of the various research projects carried out there in Thailand is to lay the groundwork for bringing the Thais into the Japanese-U.S. sphere of influence. I have no doubt that, in fact, it seems clear that the evidence is, in fact, overwhelming that this judgment is accurate. But even if, let's say I'm wrong about thinking that the judgment is accurate, is it not, in fact, a legitimate question whether, let's say, whether the weight of research about a certain society, say Thailand or Harlem, or you take your choice, whether the weight of research about that society should be outside of the control of that society, available not to members of that society and their democratic structures, if they exist, but rather available to those who, in the larger society, domestic or international, have the power to make use of this research for their own purposes. These are very important questions, and it's a scandal that the consideration of them has been so long delayed and is even now so marginal to the concerns of most academic intellectuals, at least outside of the student movement, where questions of this sort are very current. In fact, it's the great merit of the student movement to have insistently brought such questions to general awareness. And it's not too surprising that the movement that has in fact been in the forefront, almost alone, one might say, in trying to bring to an end the intense politicization of the universities, is now accused of introducing politicization into the universities. Those who make that accusation were not concerned, and still are not concerned, about the overwhelming politicization of the past generation, of which I've just mentioned a tiny facet. It's important to bear all of this in mind, I think, now that the student movement is under such intensive attack from many quarters. It's important to bear in mind how profound its impact has been during the decade of its renewed existence. As Kenneth Keniston recently pointed out, research on student activism has shown that it is overwhelmingly related to the issues of war and racism. No one questions the significant contribution, enormous contribution, one might say, of the student movement since its earliest beginnings to the efforts, which still are only marginally successful, to overcome traditional racist practices and structures. And in connection with the war, the student movement has in fact been virtually alone, certainly been the only organized force in white American society, in taking a principled stand in opposition to the war. There's plenty of opposition to the war, but I said a principled stand. And by that I mean opposition to the war that's based not on its cost, or not on the fact that the United States probably can't get away with what it's been trying to do in Indochina, but rather opposition that's based on the principle that the United States has neither the authority nor the competence to use its power to intervene in the internal affairs of other societies, as, let's say, in its assault against the peasant societies of Indochina, or in its more successful counterinsurgency efforts in Thailand and elsewhere. What's more, this principled stand has been reasonably successful, not, unfortunately, in fostering principled opposition to the war among other segments of the population. There it has been virtually without success, but rather in raising the domestic costs of the war to the point where policymakers have been forced to readjust their tactics and to restrict, somewhat at least, the means of destruction that they would otherwise be free to employ. This, I think, is an achievement of historic importance, and I think one can say this without exaggeration. The survival, in fact, of Indochina is probably, to this day, it may not continue to survive, has to a large extent been determined by this principled opposition, which has, difficult as it is to say given what has happened there, has to some extent restrained the exercise of unlimited American destructive power there. This is a striking example of the importance of choosing action on the part of a segment of the intellectual community, mostly students in this case, choosing action in place of the permissiveness towards history and those who are leading it to catastrophe. A clear example of the effectiveness of this choice of action was the student strike last spring. We do not know, and probably never will know, just what the Nixon administration had in mind when it launched the invasion of Cambodia, and we can't know for certain that there were also plans for an invasion of southern Laos. But there's reason to believe that both in Cambodia and Laos, much more destructive and massive intervention might have been undertaken and was probably planned had it not been for the spontaneous student reaction, which incidentally had two kinds of effect. While on the one hand, the effect of hampering the war makers, also, on the other hand, aiding those who wish to drive the country back to the conformist subservience of earlier years by facilitating their efforts to frighten the population, and this one might add as this dual effect is not an infrequent consequence of effective political action, a consequence that has to be balanced and considered by those who undertake action. I think in this case, at least, there's little doubt, in my judgment at least, that this particular example of the choice of action was fully justified when the range of consequences is weighed. However, we don't have to speculate about what might have been in trying to determine the effect of student activism. We have direct testimony, and I think it's important to pay very careful attention to it. Direct testimony from people who are close to the implementation of policy. Consider, for example, Townsend Hoops, whose recent writings are very important and should be read and thought about. He was the former Undersecretary of the Air Force in the Johnson administration, and he switched from hawk to dove, as you may recall, in the spring of 1968. In writing about this switch, Hoops writes the following. He says that the rebels of Indochina are inviting the West, which possesses unanswerable military power, to carry its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide. He says, however, that we stop short of genocide. The reason is because of our Christian values and because of our recognition that genocide is too terrible a burden to bear. However, when he goes on to discuss the matter, he offers a somewhat more persuasive explanation of why we have stopped short so far of true genocide, contenting ourselves with a violent attack on the peasant society of South Vietnam and Laos that has turned the land into a moonscape of craters and defoliated forests and barren rice fields, and that has moved something like 70% of the population in South Vietnam alone from their original habitat. He explains that the U.S. political objective defines free choice for the people of South Vietnam as a process necessarily excluding the NLF Viet Cong from participation in either elections or government. For this aim, he writes, military victory is a prerequisite. And Hoops came finally to disagree with the commitment to a military victory, which has this political goal in mind, because, he says, it would be possible only at the price of literally destroying South Vietnam, tearing apart the social and political fabric of our own country, and harming our international relations. More specifically, he writes, it would cause anti-war demonstrations and draft resistance to increase, reinforced by civil rights groups concerned with domestic problems. Elsewhere, he explains further that Vietnam, I'm quoting now, Vietnam is not, of course, the only source of division in American society, but it is the most pervasive issue of our discord, the catalytic agent that stimulates and magnifies all other divisive issues. In particular, there can be no truce between the generations, no end to the bitterness and alienation of even the large majority of our youth that is neither revolutionary nor irresponsible until Vietnam is terminated. I might note, incidentally, that there could hardly be a stronger argument for continued demonstrations, draft resistance, disruption, and evidence of bitterness and alienation than these remarks. That is, there could hardly be a stronger argument for people who do not choose to see the United States carry its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide. Because, as he is saying fairly clearly, it is precisely these factors that led at least one decision maker, and in fact we know from testimony many others, to decide to stop short of carrying that strategic logic to the final conclusion. In short, I think that there's little doubt that the choice of action by one segment of American intellectuals, American students in this case, has been significant and effective, and in my opinion, by and large, though not totally justified and beneficial, in connection, that is, with the specific issues of war and racism, to which most student activism, in fact, is key. However, the consequences of all this have been still greater, and I think it's worth thinking about them. As I've noted already, there has been a challenge raised to the conformist subservience of the universities to their intense politicization during the Cold War years. In fact, to the whole system of beliefs and expectations that might be referred to, let's say, as the Cold War ideology. And as a consequence, for the first time in many years, it has become possible to raise serious questions about American society, about industrial society, about its values in general. Recall, again, the prophetic and pathetic voice that I quoted earlier, recall its apocalyptic conclusions or near conclusions, Morgenthau's remarks. Such analyses and evaluations are far cry from the rhetoric of the turn of the preceding decade. In 1959, you may recall, it was possible for a very distinguished American sociologist to write that the fundamental political problems of the Industrial Revolution have been solved. This very triumph of the democratic social revolution in the West ends domestic politics for those intellectuals who must have ideologies or utopias to motivate them to political action. Compare these remarks with Morgenthau's a decade later, with his statement that the problems of industrial society are not susceptible to rational solutions within the existing system of distribution of power. As a matter of fact, there are very few people today who would celebrate the end of ideology and the solution of the political problems of industrial society in anything like the terms I've just quoted from Seymour Martin Lipset. In contrast, some at least believe with Morgenthau that the great social and political issues are not susceptible to rational solutions given the present distribution of power in American society and in fact other industrial societies, all other industrial societies without exception. In consequence, many are seeking, correctly and properly, for a rational social theory, an ideology if you like, that will suggest effective political action of a very different sort than would be appropriate if indeed we had witnessed the triumph of the democratic social revolution. In the domain of international politics, the justification for other forms of political action, civil disobedience, for example, seems to me much more obvious. One hears occasionally the argument that such actions are inappropriate in a democracy. Quite apart from the inevitable restrictions on democracy that necessarily exist under contemporary state capitalism in its militarized and highly concentrated form, quite apart from the overriding and in effect uncontrolled role of the executive in creating and implementing policy, for example, in fighting secret wars as it's been doing in Laos for the past 6 years. Quite apart from all of this, the question certainly arises what price the peasants of Indochina are expected to pay so that American life can continue tranquil and undisturbed. In fact, even if we granted that the United States was an absolutely perfectly functioning democracy in which, as Lipset says, the democratic social revolution had totally triumphed, one could accept that for the sake of argument and still conclude that there is no principle whatsoever that requires that the peasants of Indochina be, let's say, wiped out or their society destroyed because this perfectly functioning democratic society has so willed it. I'd like to try to project these considerations slightly into the future. I mentioned earlier Townsend Hoop's judgment that student activism and the costs that it produces are primarily a consequence of the Vietnam War. The Hurd report to President Nixon expressed itself in similar terms as, in fact, did the Scranton Commission. It's very interesting to look at the executive reaction to all of this, as expressed by people like Agnew or Mitchell or Sidney Hook and others. The reaction has endeavored to dissociate campus protest from the war, to deny, in other words, the connection between the war and what is tearing apart American society, in direct contradiction to the results of all independent studies, whether by social scientists or by presidential commissions or whatever. And it's quite clear why this is the tack that has to be taken. The logic of taking it is quite clear. The administration is hoping to be able to conduct what it calls, borrowing a term from the British counterinsurgency expert Sir Robert Thompson, what it calls a long-haul, low-cost effort in Vietnam, which can go on indefinitely. But now, if you're going to carry out a long-haul, low-cost effort, you have to reduce the cost. And the main cost is the bitterness and alienation of our youth. and all of these other descriptions that I read. Now, unfortunately, here we run into a difficulty because this cost is in fact directly tied to Vietnam and cannot be eliminated as long as the Vietnam War continues. So the conclusion is quite obvious. Deny that this is a cost of the war. Rather, attribute it to drugs or Dr. Spock or radical professors or weak administrators or whatever. That is precisely the conclusion that is given in the official executive reaction and that is spreading over the country today, and the logic of it is clear. It is directly related, in fact, an almost necessary consequence from two facts. First, the decision to continue to prolong the war indefinitely as a long-haul, low-cost effort, and secondly, the fact that the cost of the war, which is great, the cost in alienation and disruption and student unrest and so on, is in fact key to that. It must follow, if one accepts this framework, that it is necessary to try to somehow pin this cost on something else. Now, there's another element to this same strategy. Instead of my describing it, let me quote again from one of America's outstanding political commentators, Art Buchwald, in a column that he had a couple of days ago. He's referring to an imaginary conversation that he had with a communist friend of his who he says was practically in tears as he told me how the party was falling apart. "We're not a menace to anyone anymore," he said, "and everyone is ignoring us. Red baiting has gone out of style. It's disgusting." "How do you explain it?" I asked. "No one can get any mileage out of attacking communists in the United States anymore. Student baiting is the big thing now. The red hunters are spending all their time attacking students and professors and administrators. Nobody gives a damn what we do. We haven't been able to get in the newspapers in months. As far as Agnew is concerned, the biggest enemy to the United States is no longer Karl Marx, but Dr. Spock. He says this really has a terrible effect on the party. Half of our membership was made up of FBI undercover agents. We depended on them for all of our financial aid as they were the only ones who paid their dues. Now they're leaving in droves to enroll at colleges and universities. Our cells are down to nothing. Well, the only good effect of all of this is that maybe it's a new resource for the peace movement. But other than that, which could certainly use some people who pay their dues, even if they're FBI agents. Aside from that, though, I think he's pointing to something quite real and very important. It's worth remembering that to understand what the importance of what he's referring to, I think it's necessary to think about what the social function was of red baiting in American society in the post-war years. After all, it wasn't just a mass paranoia, although it was also that. Its social function was expressed very succinctly, and in my opinion entirely accurately, by William Williams when he wrote that after World War II, American power was adroitly deployed behind the banner of anti-communism, a psychological and political strategy that was as successful as it was commonplace. The imperial majority of American leaders recognized that the populace would have to be re-aroused to sustain the kind of activity and the related costs that they had supported during the war. Senator Arthur Vandenberg was merely being more candid than most of his colleagues when he remarked that it would be necessary to scare hell out of the American people, quote from Vandenberg. The specter of communism met that need. It's a very accurate description, I think. You can add nothing to it. And let's not forget how successful this campaign was, not only for the population, but for the leadership as well. A good example of how successful it was, for a very good example, take a look at, I'd suggest if you haven't done so already, that you take a look at a recent interview, long, quite fascinating interview with Eugene Rostow in the New Yorker on July 4th. In it, he's asked what the consequences would be of the loss of South Vietnam in his view, and he explains that apparently the straight face, that the loss of South Vietnam would, first of all, lead to the loss of Japan. Interesting that this is probably one of the major motivations during the 1950s in entering into Indochina, at that time not a totally irrational idea. And after the loss of Japan, The next thing that would happen by some mechanism that he doesn't specify is that we would lose Latin America, and then after that, Russia would take over the Middle East and threaten Europe as hostage, so we lose Europe. And he says after that, the United States would be reduced to the status of Finland. That is, the Russians would be able to tell us who to run in our elections and who to elect. He says we would not be reduced to the level of Poland, but we would approach that. This, if we withdraw from South Vietnam. I mention Walt Rostow because he is precisely, Eugene Rostow, sorry, the brother, because not only because he was a high advisor during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and dean of the Yale Law School before and Sterling professor of law and such things, but because he is a rather typical member of the Kennedy elite of intellectuals, the group which does represent, I think, probably one might say the most balanced and perhaps sane, I don't know what, group that was anywhere near the formation and implementation of policy in recent history. It's very interesting to see how they characterize their own views in earlier years. Again, Townsend Hoops, writing of the policymakers of the Kennedy administration, he was one of them. He says they operated on the implicit assumption that henceforth Washington would be predisposed to view an effort to overthrow the existing order anywhere as a national liberation war fomented by and for the benefit of Russia or China. Johnson's advisors, Kennedy men, all carried in their veins the implicitly unlimited commitment to global struggle against revolutionary communism. The prevailing assumption was, still quoting Hoops, that the communist bloc remained an essentially cohesive international conspiracy manifesting itself primarily in military and paramilitary assaults against that other comprehensible entity, the free world. And so, in fact, we do find people like the brothers Rostow, Dean Acheson, and many others, pretending that, for example, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Vietnamese War against the French in 1946, pretending that this was fomented by Stalin, as in fact they claimed, at a time when Stalin probably didn't even know where Vietnam was, in fact. And to this day, it's an item of faith that Stalin was responsible for the Greek Civil War. Townsend Hoops, in this effort that I've just been quoting from to eliminate from the illusions of the Cold War years, nevertheless reiterates this myth, and it is a total myth. The facts are entirely different and are known to be different. And I could continue. Now, you know, Russian imperialism is certainly real enough. There's no question about it. Russian totalitarianism is real enough. The Czechs and the Hungarians, many others can testify to that. What was entirely unreal was the system of beliefs that was erected on these facts in an effort precisely to scare hell out of the American people. And it did succeed. It succeeded so well, in fact, that the leaders of American society are now paying a very serious cost for it. Because, of course, one of the problems of building up a national psychosis is that you can't turn it on and off at will. There are many people who would like to turn it off right now so that they could cut their losses in what obviously is not a paying proposition, namely the effort to subjugate Indochina. People like Clark Clifford and many other enlightened members of the corporate elite have urged that we end this war, but we're not doing it, and we won't do it. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but I think that the main one is that any politician knows that he will be committing political suicide if he leaves Indochina. Even if 99% of the American population are in favor of it on the day that he does it, the natural advantage that any demagogue always has, witness the success of Agnew in the last few months, the natural advantage of any demagogue will very quickly convert this abandonment of Indochina, which of course will turn ultimately into a communist victory, since they are the people with the programs and the mass of the population, or the only organized part of the population, will convert this into a kind of treachery, into another loss of China. And in this connection, it's worth mentioning that recently there have been finally some detailed studies of American decision-making in Indochina over the past 20 years. There's a very beautiful and careful analysis by Daniel Ellsberg, still unpublished, which is given at the American Political Science Association, which he points out that the operative principle, I think this is quite convincing, the operative principle at every moment has been not, great geopolitical considerations, though those were in the background, but rather the assumption that this year would be a bad year to lose Indochina, maybe next year. And of course, as he points out, that's a recursive procedure for continuing the war indefinitely. And the reason why it would be a bad year to lose Indochina is in part because of the paranoid anti-communist psychosis, which was so successfully whipped up by these very same leaders in their effort to scare hell out of the American people and mobilize them behind domestic and international policies. So there's a complicated situation. However, this paranoid system of beliefs is no longer entirely tenable, though there are still people like Eugene Rostow around. Very few literate people are willing today to believe that either that domestic communists are a threat to the United States or that communism is a monolithic conspiracy directed from Moscow and Peking. And this erosion of the Cold War ideology is a very serious matter, because the Cold War ideology has served very well as a technique for mobilizing the American population in support of national policy by scaring hell out of them, although it also has such unwanted effects as those that I mentioned. There are two aspects of national policy that are particularly critical in this respect. First, domestic. Have in mind the government-induced, largely military production and the related research, which involves about two-thirds of the scientists and engineers in the country and a very large part of the labor force, and which undoubtedly has been a major force in preserving what's called economic health since World War II. Of course, it's very costly, and it's tolerated by the taxpayer because his leaders succeeded in scaring hell out of him at a fearsome social cost. And the second aspect of policy behind which it's been necessary to mobilize the American people by scaring hell out of them is the international aspect. Woodrow Wilson, when he became president, made it clear that it was official American policy to open the doors of all the weaker countries to an invasion of American capital and enterprise. The words are those of his Secretary of State, Bryan, in 1914. That has been and remains American policy. Since World War II, the specter of communism has met the need to mobilize the American people in support of that objective, with very interesting and weird effects, such as the ones I noticed, and many others. For example, one effect is that in Indochina we've been led to destroy physically, to attempt at least to destroy, the only forces in the country that have any capacity to mobilize the population, to overcome ethnic rivalries, to introduce social and economic programs of some sort that might have some meaning for the mass of the population. Now, these objectives have not changed. There's no serious move towards dismantling the system of militarized state capitalism at home, no serious moves towards fostering or even permitting independent national development on the part of societies that choose to extricate themselves from the American world system. And this is a serious matter. Same objectives, but the technique for mobilizing the population, the technique of social control, is beginning to erode. In other words, the ideology of anti-communism, it seems, is no longer adequate to mobilize the population. It's not eroded entirely, but it's losing its power. So quite naturally, there's going to be a search for some new technique of ideological mobilization. And I'm reasonably sure that Art Buchwald has put his finger right on it. I've already pointed out that student protest has overwhelmingly been keyed to the war and to racial discrimination, and there is no intention of ending the war and accepting the consequences of a defeat for a 20-year effort to dominate Southeast Asia, as there is no real possibility of implementing the kinds of programs that might overcome the domestic inequities of power and control. Therefore, it is necessary to isolate, if possible destroy, those forces that are raising the cost of present policies to intolerable levels. Now, there are factions in the student movement, or formerly in the student movement, that see themselves as the representative in the affluent white community of third world revolutionaries and radical currents in the American ethnic communities. Whatever one may think of these ideas, it's pretty clear that to the FBI mentality, they form a pretty neat pattern, quite well designed to replace the communist threat as a technique of social control. And it's therefore not too surprising that some of the same people who helped 15 years, 20 years ago, Same people who helped convert a justified opposition to communist totalitarianism into a paranoid anti-communist crusade are now to be found attacking the student movement with all the subtlety of a bludgeon, specifically refusing to consider the context of protest, the question of legitimacy of aims, simply trying to discredit any effort to raise the cost of the destruction of Indochina, and with some success. And I must say, with some participation by students who themselves have taken a choice of action that is very well designed to lead to the realization of these ends, but not, unfortunately, to lead to saving Indochina from destruction. It seems to me that the proper attitude to take 15 years ago, let's say, was to condemn communist totalitarianism, because it deserved condemnation richly, and yet at the same time to expose the political and social goals of those who used it, very cynically for the most part, for their own anti-communist crusade, for expanding American power. And today, I think it's also necessary to condemn domestic terrorism while exposing the political and social goals of those who are trying to whip up a new crusade, a new technique of social control based on such actions. This enters into a pretty complicated matters, and I don't personally find the answers very easy. For example, there are some forms of sabotage. I have in mind in particular, let's say, what was undertaken by the Berrigans, draft file destruction. These, it seems to me, seem quite justifiable given the social context in which they're undertaken and the manner in which they're undertaken. There are others which I think are entirely not justifiable when one thinks of their character, the character of the means, and the goals that they're likely to achieve. So at this point in one's thinking about these matters, I think one turns to rather hard questions concerning the choice of action. There are conflicting values. There are no glib answers. For example, we should very definitely have a commitment to the democratic process, even in the flawed democracy of contemporary militarized state capitalism. At the same time, we should have a commitment, which unfortunately is a conflicting commitment, to the existence of Vietnam as a cultural and historical entity. I'd like to recall to you the prophecy or warning of Bernard Fall, who was a military man, quite in sympathy with American goals, and certainly no alarmist. His judgment that Vietnam as a cultural and historical entity is threatened with extinction under the American assault. This was a judgment expressed 3 years and 3 million tons of bombs ago. These commitments are, in fact, in conflict. It's highly likely, I think, that nothing short of massive civil disobedience could terminate the American attack on the peasant society of Indochina. And to help create the basis for that mass civil disobedience by creating an appreciation of its necessity and a willingness to participate in it on the part of the mass of the population, that task is, I think, a fundamental one. I don't know if it's a realizable one. We should have a commitment to the rule of law, but this commitment also is hardly clear in the choice of action to which it leads. I think a very strong case can be made, to me it seems on purely intellectual grounds, an overwhelming case, that the United States executive is openly flouting domestic and international law in Vietnam. Might say, incidentally, that it's often argued that this is a technical issue that must be left to the experts. Like most such injunctions, this one conceals a political purpose, the purpose of fostering conformist subservience. In fact, the issues are not all that complex. And when you read the detailed briefs presented by both sides, you discover that the argument is really turning on certain factual questions, certain factual issues of historical interpretation, where the responsible citizen can and most definitely should make a judgment. Some people argue that the matter should be left to the courts, but surely that's a rather unpersuasive argument as well. For example, a recent Department of Justice brief urged that the courts not hear cases concerning the legality of the war because of the domestic consequences that might ensue if the judgment were that the executive is engaged in criminal acts. Now, this point is actually well taken, and it indicates quite clearly one reason why it's irresponsible to rely on the determination of the judiciary in this kind of situation. One reason. There are other reasons. The most obvious being the obvious question of prejudice. when a branch of the government is asked to rule on that government's possible crimes. There is, quite apart from this, the question whether the law must be obeyed, no matter what the consequences, as an absolute value. I think there are very few people who would agree that it must be obeyed, no matter what the consequences, as an absolute value. But the question, in any event, is academic, if it is true, as it seems to me, that a citizen is not required to join in the criminal acts of his government, but should rather seek to restrain these acts, perhaps violating statutes in the course of so acting. We should furthermore be committed to nonviolence. But even here, the questions are not trivial. A pure pacifist, whose views personally I respect but cannot share, pure pacifist has certain answers, but even he does not have all the answers. Even to him, the question arises, and at the moment is being seriously debated, as to whether or not destruction of property is a form of violence. For example, the kind of activity that the Berrigans, who do regard themselves as pacifists, carried out. For the non-pacifist, there are not only these questions, but many others, much harder. Because the non-pacifist, which does include virtually everybody, the non-pacifist believes, if he's willing to say, whether he's willing to say so or not, but he in effect believes, by virtue of being a non-pacifist, that violence may be justified if it will prevent still greater violence. At that point, a tangled web of questions with no very easy answers arises. One has to ask questions about the intrinsic legitimacy of the means employed and the intended ends, about the likelihood that these means will lead to these ends, or will they fail, or will they, by their very character, distort these ends. And one has to also inquire into unintended consequences. These are not easy questions. To me, it seems that a consideration of all of these factors leads to the conclusion that nonviolent resistance and nonviolent civil disobedience, ranging from, say, draft and tax resistance and general strikes, if possible, and so on, ranging from there over to actions such as those of the Berrigans, are, it seems to me, a legitimate and potentially efficacious course of action under present circumstances. But I don't see how anyone can believe that the choice of that course of action is clear, and I think one must reject out of hand the contention that such actions are illegitimate, apart from the consideration of the social and political context in which they are undertaken, as I think one must reject out of hand the kind of domestic terrorism which, quite apart from the issue of the intrinsic illegitimacy of the means employed, is not designed to make the society ungovernable and thereby contribute to ending the war, but rather is designed precisely to make the society very easily governable, and governable in the worst possible way, in a way which will mobilize American opinion for a final, perhaps genocidal assault on the Vietnamese, and who knows how many other people. In this discussion of the choice of action, I've tried to stay fairly close to questions that have a certain immediacy, rather than focusing in a more general and abstract way on the problem of the relations of intellectuals to society. The reason is the one I mentioned, namely that these questions, to which I don't want to pretend that I have any answers, I have my own answers, but I don't think they're terribly convincing, these questions have a desperate urgency to them. The erosion of the Cold War ideology threatens a stable system of social control from within, as the resistance of the peasants of Indochina threatens it from without. And we can therefore expect, with some degree of confidence, that strong efforts will be made to reinstitute the conservative consensus of the post-war years and to continue towards what former Senator Joseph Clark, borrowing a phrase from Toynbee, recently called the Germanization of the United States. There will be continuing efforts, which may or may not succeed, to scare hell out of the American people so that they will support domestic and international policies that may indeed be ineradicable, as Morgenthau asserts, given the present distribution of power, centralization of decision-making in American society. And this process of Germanization may indeed be furthered by a kind of moral degeneracy, the only term I can think of, sorry if it has a pompous sound, kind of moral degeneracy that has been induced by the war. I have in mind the process of habituation to atrocity, the very natural tendency to project our failings, our crimes, even onto the victims, as though in some sense they are responsible for them. I think a touch of this attitude is revealed in the quotation from Townsend Hoops that I read earlier, when he wrote, "The rebels of Indochina are inviting the West, which possesses unanswerable military power, to follow its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide." If you check the context of this assertion, it strengthens the suspicion that Hoops is blaming the rebels of Indochina for calling down this terror upon their heads. This kind of projection takes a particularly brutal form, for example. I want to give one example in the observations of a quite excellent correspondent of the Washington Post, a man who incidentally is quite opposed to the war, who recently wrote an account of his own personal reaction to a year and a half in Vietnam. This war, he writes, is a horrible mistake. The United States, he says, has never accepted the fundamental differentness of Vietnam. Those aspects of this society that compel beggars to buy and steal babies who might help them look more pathetic in Saigon's filthy gutters. It's all too easy to forget or ignore the stupefying venality of South Vietnamese society, the selfishness of ordinary Vietnamese, the almost total lack of civic spirit in this society. The fundamental American optimism about human nature can be put to a severe test in this society, where cause and effect don't work the way they do in America, and so on. This comment, which was printed in many newspapers without any reaction at all, either editorial or in letters, and I've just sampled a tiny bit of it, has a very simple point to it. First, we destroy and demolish the rural society of Vietnam. First, we drive millions of peasants into the miserable slums of Saigon, which now has twice the population density of Tokyo. Then, after having done this, we blame them because the beggars buy and steal babies who may help them look more pathetic in Saigon's filthy slums. It's their selfishness that puts our fundamental optimism about human nature to such a severe test. It's their stupefying venality that we deplore, the lack of civic spirit on the part of a people who've been fighting for 25 years against every horror that Western ingenuity can devise. I don't really know how one can respond effectively to such profound moral degeneracy, whether by words or by actions. But I do think that the future for America is rather grim unless some slow process of cultural and ideological change takes place in the United States that makes it possible for the American people to face up honestly to what they've done, either by direct decision or submissiveness and conformist subservience. Since many young people seem quite capable of reacting in a decent and human fashion to this reality, I think it's quite certain that the divisiveness and bitterness that are rending American society will continue so long as their elders remain capable of immunizing themselves, of denying obvious facts, of constructing pathetic rationalizations, for example, projecting onto the victims the atrocities that we have done to them, and refusing to take a principled stand against aggression and imperial conquest, and against the quite inevitable terror of a war that's conducted by the world's greatest technological power against a virtually defenseless peasant population. Unfortunately, there's very little indication of any such cultural and ideological change. On the contrary, as I indicated earlier, there's a marked tendency to turn against the youthful tormentors who continue to call for honesty and decency, for a realistic and humane response to facts that can no longer be concealed. If many young people are being driven from commitment to fanaticism, as in fact they are, and that is extremely unfortunate for themselves and for American and world society, if they are being done so, then if that is happening, and it is, then the responsibility falls very largely, I think, on those who have failed to find a more effective course of action. To believe otherwise is to react in a way quite similar to those who blame the Vietnamese beggar for his selfishness and venality. It's always very tempting to focus attention on the irrationality, the intolerable abuse, the unjustifiable terror, occasionally, of those who are fundamentally raising deeply disturbing questions, questions that would, if taken seriously, lead to a choice of action that might be very painful and difficult. How much easier to deflect the questions and deplore the perhaps quite deplorable excesses of those who raise the questions. Fact of the matter is that the sum total of all youthful fanaticism, in my opinion, is barely detectable when weighed in the balance against the criminal refusal to act in a principled way to save Indochina from destruction. The intolerable smugness of those who watch in silence while berating the young for their fanaticism may secure these silent participants in violence from self-doubt, may secure them from the painful personal consequences of commitment. It will not, however, save the country from a terrible tragedy, as many young people are driven from commitment to fanaticism in the face of the lethargy and the submissiveness of the adult community. It's one thing to carry out a witch hunt against domestic communists, a marginal group that existed largely in the imagination of the FBI and Sidney Hook. It's something else to launch a crusade against the brightest, best educated, most idealistic segments of American youth. The outlines of such a crusade are now beginning to appear, quite obviously, and the long-term consequences for American and international society are quite incalculable.
Take questions from the floor if there are any. You have a question?
Do you regard the mass of the American people as being victims or accomplices and at the same time?
I think they're both. They're victims and they're accomplices. And what is particularly striking about the present situation is that that has now also become true, I think, of the ruling elite, who are obviously accomplices in the policies that they have engineered over the past 25 years and are now also victims in those policies. Because I think there is very little doubt that at least the more rational elements in the American ruling elite, people who like Clark Clifford, for example, would very much like to get out of what is by now a completely, from just a plain business point of view, kind of insane involvement and cannot do so. And a fortiori, the same is true of the mass of the American people. They're accomplices because they don't stop the actions. They're victims because they've been subjected and have permitted themselves to be subjected to the incredible propaganda barrage of the past 25 years, which has so depoliticized American society.
But in the aisle up here.
At what point does commitment, which you praise, become fanaticism in people's name?
Well, that's the point where I think there are no very easy answers. Again, all I can do is mention the obvious considerations and then tell you what they seem to indicate to me. I think one has to consider in choosing an action the intrinsic character of the action itself. Is it a legitimate kind of action? Does it, for example, harm innocent people, let's say? Does it violate the kind of rights and commitments that we do have a proper commitment to? One has to ask that question. One also has to ask, what about the end to which it is directed? Is that a legitimate end? And one has to ask, what's the likelihood that it's going to contribute to that end? Or what's the likelihood that it will rather contribute to a very different end? What is the likelihood that the end will in fact be determined by the character of the means, as pacifists have continually argued over the years? I don't think these are very easy questions, and what they suggest to me, again, I've felt this for many years, is that the proper technique in the United States, given the present social reality, is a form of nonviolent civil disobedience. Nonviolent because I think that violent civil disobedience will have, apart from the fact that intrinsically it's of, in my opinion at least, has the intrinsically illegitimate character, though I can imagine circumstances in which it would be appropriate, will, I think it's very likely, almost certain, lead to the mobilization of the American people behind the most repressive international policies. So, for example, I think people who, let's take just the war, people who are thinking of their responsibility, who think that they have a responsibility to the Vietnamese, let's say, who have a responsibility to prevent that society from destruction, save it from destruction. These people must seriously consider the effect of what they do. The fact that it's well-intentioned is irrelevant if it's going to lead to the kind of mobilization of American society which will simply call forth greater terror in the war against Vietnam. And I think that, in my opinion, the kind of terrorism which is now taking place will have precisely that effect. And for that reason, it's fails on all counts that I can think of. On the other hand, let's take something which seems to me kind of at the border, something like, let's say, the Berrigans, burning of draft files. Now, it seems to me that I would go along with somebody like Dan Berrigan in saying that that is nonviolent civil disobedience, that destruction of property in that sense is not a form of violence, and that there is some property that has no right to exist. I think that's a legitimate position. And I think furthermore that, but again, intentions are not what matters here. Consequences are very largely what matters. And I think that that kind of action can be carried out, and very often has been carried out, in such a way as to be comprehensible to significant segments of the population who, if they're not quite willing to join in on such actions, might be willing to raise their level of commitment to opposition to the war. Or take something like a mass strike. If it were possible to develop a mass general strike against the war, I admit it looks quite unlikely today, then I think that would be quite legitimate, although, in some respects one might say it violates a commitment to democracy. Well, I would agree that in some respects it does, but it seems to me entirely legitimate when one considers the various factors that I mentioned. And so it goes. I think it's hard to, I don't know if anybody has any easy way to make these decisions, but I think they really have to be thought, these questions have to be thought about quite hard.
Another question back there.
Do you think that the debunking of the growing awareness of ecological issues by some of the people on the left is unjustifiable fanaticism?
The debunking of ecological issues, whether that is...
The growing awareness of ecological issues.
Yeah, you mean the ridicule of this growing awareness. Is that unjustifiable fanaticism? Well, I think that's too strong a term for it. I think it's not the most productive or truly radical way to respond to this growing awareness. I think one ought to point out what I believe is true, that the whole ecological issue is a bit of a red herring. It's true, I mean, it does exist, of course, the ecological issue, but it is being used to try to divert people's attention from, from such ecological effects. See, all the pollution in the air in New York doesn't begin to compare with, let's say, the destruction by defoliation of an area the size of Massachusetts in Vietnam. But, so...
That's the point. The consequences of the increased ecological consciousness are that we'll see.
That it's wrong to destroy Vietnam? I don't think it's going to have that effect, no. I think what it's going to do is turn attention away from that. But still, I think that to debunk it and ridicule it is wrong, because I think there's an important point there. It seems to me the whole concern over ecology is one factor of a general demonstration of what's wrong of why capitalism is an intrinsically impossible system. Namely, I think what it ought to be used for is an effort to show, and this has to be done responsibly and seriously, that a system that doesn't take account of what the economists like to put in footnotes as externalities, doesn't take account of the social costs of production, the social costs of consumption, doesn't take account of collective human needs that can in a certain sense only be collectively expressed, that aren't expressed at all in, let's say, the marketplace, which, to the extent that it exists, has a natural effect of maximizing individual consumption, let's say. I think all of this has to be analyzed, demonstrated, and I think it leads directly to the conclusion that some form of libertarian socialism should replace this destructive system. That would be, it seems to me, the proper response to the ecological issue.
Could you please comment on President Nixon's peace plan?
Could you hear? Question was about the President's latest peace plan. Well, I think that's very interesting. That's a very important question. In fact, I'm sorry I had to call off a talk this afternoon, but I was planning to talk about that. I think it was very, the peace plan is interesting, and the reaction to it is extremely interesting. See, the peace plan itself is, I think, quite transparent demand that the other side surrender. That's in effect what it says. And you can see it by the way in which it's worded. The peace plan was very carefully worded so as to make certain that it could not make the slightest contribution towards peace. And you can see that by the precise way in which it was worded. See, a fundamental element in the peace plan, for example, is a call for a meeting, a conference of states which are involved in Indochina. That's the sort of central idea. We should have a conference of the Indo-Chinese states and the other states which are involved, like the United States. And they should negotiate some settlement which the United States will then adhere to. But of course, precisely what's been at stake for the last 20 years is the legitimacy of those states. That's the whole issue. The United States has been trying for the last 20 years to, in fact, you know, I was just looking the other day at Eisenhower's memoirs, and he has a fantastic quote, I'm sorry I didn't bring it along, in 1953, in which he says that we have to make clear to the world and to the people of Indochina that what's going on there is aggression by the communists against Indochina, and that we and the French are defending Indochina from this aggression, that we must make this clear that this is the true meaning of the war. And that's what the United States has been trying to make clear ever since then. And it's about as clear now as it was clear then. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what's important, and you see, of course, this is what's implicit in the Nixon peace proposal. He's saying the three governments that we support, namely the government of Saigon, Vientiane, and Phnom Penh, and those are the legitimate descriptions of those governments. Those governments, he says, are the states which have to be brought together with the invaders from North Vietnam in order to negotiate a settlement, which means if, contrary to any plausible, any minute possibility, if contrary to that the other side were to accept it, they would have said, okay, we agree, you know, we give up. You run Indochina exactly the way you've been trying to do for the last 20 years. That's in effect what it means to recognize the legitimacy of those three states. And this was not only spelled out because of, you know, their position is, and it happens to be correct in my opinion, that those three regimes are foreign imposed regimes which exist solely because of the United States support and wouldn't have no intrinsic legitimacy and wouldn't exist without the massive American involvement. They're about as legitimate as the regime of Vichy France, let's say, although even that isn't a fair analogy because you may remember that the Germans were able to permit Vichy France to run France virtually without interference because it was a far more legitimate regime, far more deeply embedded in the population than any regime we've been able to establish in Indochina. So I withdraw that analogy. Not as legitimate as the regime of Vichy France. Now, this particular interpretation of events is central to the Nixon proposal, and what is absolutely remarkable is that at least none of the commentators I've seen have pointed to it. For example, I was reading the New York Times, this morning's Times, in the plane this morning, and there's a big editorial and an article by James Rest and all sorts of other people about the peace plan and how reasonable it is and how it, you know, makes a step towards peace and so on. Not one of them pointed out that fundamental to the peace plan is this demand that the other side recognize the legitimacy of the states that we have established and therefore surrender, because it's precisely that legitimacy that they are fighting against. And that same assumption runs through every step. For example, if you look at the PRG peace plan, so-called Viet Cong peace plan that was presented on September 17th, it spoke about release of prisoners of war, but it coupled this demand with a, again, in my opinion, perfectly proper demand that the prisoners in the concentration camps and jails in Saigon be released. Because you see, from their point of view, those are prisoners of war, because those are people who are fighting against, who are rejecting the legitimacy of the Saigon regime. And therefore, as they correctly see the war, they are prisoners of war. On the other hand, Nixon's plan very carefully and precisely avoids this issue and calls for the release of prisoners of war, but not the prisoners of the Saigon regime, or the Vientiane regime, or in the future the Phnom Penh regime. Why? Because again, he is trying to put forth a proposal which in effect amounts to surrender by the other side, namely acceptance of the legitimacy of the governments that we've imposed. And the same is true for his call for elections. I mean, you know, Nixon will be delighted to abide by elections that take place under the auspices of a government that we install that is backed by American bayonets. We can predict pretty well what the result of such elections will be, and of course so can the communists, because they've had plenty of examples to judge by. There were, for example, the election run by the CIA in Laos in 1960, which was such a miserable farce that even right-wing correspondents there were disgusted by it. And they can look at the elections, let's say, in Vietnam and South Vietnam itself a couple of years ago, when the elections which will run under the electoral provision of the law that no communist or no neutralist whose actions or views might be advantageous for the communists is permitted to run. And then, just since that wasn't quite enough, they made sure that General Ming, who it looked might have a chance to win, was kept out of the country. And then the one serious peace candidate, Ao Trong Tan, they didn't permit him. He was committed to house arrest, finally arrested completely. He wasn't permitted to run. Then, of course, there was overwhelming fraud during the election, and the peace candidate who did too well was thrown into jail. Incidentally, he's been followed by a very important deputy in the National Assembly, Chow. I don't know if you followed that. It was a very important incident because the Saigon judiciary had the courage to denounce this as unconstitutional, but of course it didn't have the slightest effect, nor did the United States ever raise its voice over the issue. And in fact, let me just mention one further thing in this connection, which you may not know. There was some of these students who've been lifting censored papers quite properly, in my opinion, have released recently the minutes of the meeting of the Vietnam Advisory Group of CDAG. This is one of these groups that describes itself as a group that exists only to sponsor research, sponsor better teaching of Vietnamese, and so on and so forth. The minutes of the meeting of, I think it was about May 3rd, 1969, and they also managed to get hold of the main paper that was given at that meeting by Samuel Huntington. And it's quite interesting, actually. The fundamental issue that was raised in the meeting was this. They said, well, we've got this problem. It looks as though the American people may not stay the course. They may not, make it possible to continue the military effort at the level that we want. So let's see if there's something else we can do. The second problem is that the NLF, the Viet Cong, are the only really significant organized political force in South Vietnam. That's next fact. So what can we do in the face of this? We may be forced into elections in which the other side is sure to win because they're the only organized force. I mean, you can argue about the percentage of the population that they control, but nobody denies that they're the only serious political force, in fact, the only group in the society that has any plans, any programs even. If this isn't obvious in itself, it's obvious by the fact that the social programs that the United States introduces, like the land reform, are just pale copies of what the NLF has carried out years ago and are openly admitted to be such. So what are we going to do in the face of this difficulty? Well, Professor Huntington has a long, interesting paper in applied social science in which he explains how by various techniques of electoral chicanery and buying of votes and coercion and so on, we might succeed in getting to win the election, even though the other side happens to be the only organized political force. And then there's a discussion about this recorded in the meetings in which most people thought this probably wasn't, we probably wouldn't be able to get away with it. And his techniques, though very interesting, probably wouldn't work, and so on and so forth. Well, the other side, so-called, they don't have to have stolen minutes of CDAG meetings to realize that that's what's going on. The history of the last 20 years amply demonstrates to them that it's perfectly insane to take the word of any representative of any Western power, particularly the United States, with respect to any political settlement. That history has amply demonstrated. I don't see anybody can question it. And therefore, they're not very likely to accept elections run by the Saigon authorities under American military domination. And so on as you run through the steps of the peace plan. It seems to me they all have this characteristic. If you ask what they really mean, I think one can say that they mean that the other side has to surrender. Now, let me just add one hopeful note. See, I don't think anything's much going to come out of this maneuvering about peace plans in Paris. But there are some things going on that are quite interesting. For example, in Paris on September 21st, there took place a very important press conference, which I believe didn't receive any mention whatsoever in the American press. At least I didn't see it. Maybe that's an index of its importance. This was by a South Vietnamese deputy, whose name is Ngo Cong Duc, D-U-C, who most people in Paris believe is probably a frontrunner for General Ming, who is generally regarded as the most popular single figure in South Vietnam. And he said some really remarkable things in this press conference. He, incidentally, is a fairly substantial citizen. He's the president of the Federation of South Vietnamese Newspaper Editors. He's the editor of the newspaper himself, Tin Song, and deputy to the National Assembly from Vinh Minh Province, and, sort of a solid citizen. He says in this thing, I'm sorry, I'll give you almost the exact wording, that the South Vietnamese people are no longer willing to take part in America's imperialist war against Vietnam, uses those terms. He says that every segment of South Vietnamese opinion now feels this, and that, maybe that's an exaggeration, but he also says that he claims that every newspaper in South Vietnam has, in some manner, as permitted by the censorship, so expressed itself. He also says that if the war does continue, if the Vietnamese people are forced to continue supporting America's imperialist designs in Vietnam, his words, then this will lead to the very likely destruction of Vietnamese society. He then states that he represents, he feels that he is speaking for the non-communist, he claims, majority of South Vietnamese who fear communism, but fear far worse the involvement in the American imperialist war of destruction. And what he asks for is a separate representation in the Paris peace talks of the majority of the South Vietnamese population. Again, these are his words, meaning those who call for an immediate settlement with the PRG and an immediate withdrawal of American troops. Now, this is very important. This expression of sentiment is very important. As I say, I didn't see a word about it in the American press, but I got the thing from the head of the Southeast Asian Bureau of Le Monde, who's very knowledgeable, and who wrote that he thought it was very important, and I've heard from other people in Paris that they too think that it's extremely important. What it probably indicates is the beginnings of some, incidentally, people who've been in touch with the PRG and DRV delegations in Paris say that they are, much more favorable in the kinds of comments they make about such initiatives than ever in the past. And I suppose that all of this indicates that there is some kind of informal contact going on between some representatives of the society governed by the Saigon administration in the United States and the PRG. And that may be important. I don't know. I think there are facts of the kind that I've mentioned, and it's very hard to know how to evaluate them. Obviously, they're not given very much publicity, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the mind of Henry Kissinger, who I presume knew about this, even if it didn't appear in the New York Times, in his mind, this may have been one of the reasons why it was necessary to produce a superficially appealing peace plan to try to abort such efforts.
Could you give us your assessment of the effectiveness of campus demonstrations and whether you think there's a potentially effective individual form of protest?
Well, when the question's put in that generality, I don't quite know what to say. I mean, I must admit that I myself, when the student movement turned, let's say around the beginning of 1968, towards the campus as a main target, I myself thought, and I still believe, that was a bad mistake. I think in the history of the student movement, one can sort of see a change between, let's say, October 67 with the Pentagon demonstration and May 68 with the Columbia strike. And I don't think that was wise, frankly, nor do I think it was principled. With all of the politicization of the universities and the involvement of the universities in war and so on, which is certainly real, I don't think the universities are in any sense a significant target for serious disruption, or for that matter, even reform. I think reform of the universities would be very nice, but it's pretty low on the level of priorities. And I think one has to keep one's priorities pretty straight. It's the militarization of American society, it's the aggressive war and so on that are the primary targets. Furthermore, I think if one looks at the universities seriously, if one asks why this politicization, here I think the student movement, by and large, at least in its published documents and the rhetoric I hear, just has, in my opinion at least, made a very sadly mistaken analysis of what's actually going on. Almost invariably, this politicization is attributed to decisions by the trustees or by the administration or something of the sort And there are any number of pamphlets going around, called Who Rules Columbia or something of that sort, which trace the corporate connections of the people on the Board of Trustees and say, well, look, with that, what can you expect the university to do? That just doesn't have anything to do with the facts, as far as I can see. The facts are, as far as I see, and I'm sort of at in one of the places that's the center of this, MIT, that the involvement of the quite undeniable involvement of the university in the militarization of American society, in the American wars overseas and so on, it's certainly undeniable, I wouldn't deny it for a minute, that this has been the result not of trustee decisions, not of administration decisions, but of what unfortunately are relatively free choices on the part of the students and the faculty. And that means that the problem is much more serious and is not going to be solved by demonstrating against the trustees. It's going to be solved by changing in a very fundamental way the commitments, personal commitments, the group commitments, if you like, of the bodies that actually constitute the universities. So at least, I don't know every university, obviously, but at least in my experience, the universities are pretty well decentralized institutions that reflect reasonably adequately, at least faculty opinion, usually at a departmental level, and to a certain extent even student opinion. Now, there are plenty of changes possible, and I think there are good changes possible. But basically, I think that these changes are rather insignificant. I must say that. And it seems to me that the fundamental change that is necessary is this change in what was and still remains an essentially free decision. Now, one might say, well, it wasn't a free decision because the rewards for going along with for conformist subservience, if you like, were much higher than the rewards for, the negative rewards, the punishments for refusing to go along. And in many ways, that's true. You weren't going to get fat research contracts and have to wait longer for a professorship and all sorts of other things if you didn't go along with the general drift of things. But, that's really pretty small potatoes. It's hard to see why a person shouldn't be willing to put up with delaying his professorship or losing a research grant if he's sincerely convinced that participation in the militaristic activities of the United States is unjustifiable. Now, so it seems to me that insofar as student disruption and unrest is directed towards reform of the universities or change in the universities, it is by and large directed at the wrong target and is the wrong means. On the other hand, I think probably, I think that's not always the aim of it. For example, let's take the anti-ROTC campaigns. That's a different matter. ROTC is a significant effort in the military assault on Indochina. There's no doubt on that. It provides a significant part of the officer corps. And I think that efforts to undermine this contribution to the destruction of Indochina are quite legitimate. That raises again the question of what are effective efforts. And again, my opinion is that the most effective effort is by modifying, changing substantially the kind of commitment, the kind of ideology, the kind of set of beliefs that did lead people to be willing to take part in this institution. In my opinion, that's much more effective than burning down an ROTC building, which very likely will have the opposite effect. So I think that some kinds of, I say this with some hesitancy, these are pretty delicate judgments, and there are a lot of factors, and one might easily come to different conclusions about many of these things, but that's the way it looks to me.
I'm afraid we have to make that the last question. Anybody who wants to or has a real personal issue, I'm sure, can catch Professor Chomsky on his way out. Thank you.